It feels devastating when you give someone your love, honesty, and emotional energy only to feel as though none of it mattered. Maybe you reached out hoping for answers, searched for clarity, or simply wished to hear the words, "I'm sorry," but instead you were met with silence. That silence has a unique way of creating deep emotional pain because it leaves you questioning everything. You wonder what happened, what you did wrong, and why someone who once seemed to care can now act as though your feelings don't exist. Being ignored doesn't just create sadness, it leaves you feeling unseen and unimportant. Yet hidden inside this painful experience is an opportunity that most people never recognize. If you stay until the end, you'll discover how to inspire an avoidant person to genuinely recognize the hurt they caused, while also rebuilding your confidence, protecting your dignity, and regaining the emotional control that may have felt lost. One of the hardest truths to accept is that when an avoidant refuses to acknowledge the damage they've done, their behavior usually says much more about their inner world than it does about your value. Their unwillingness to apologize often comes from fears they've spent years trying to outrun. Emotional closeness can feel threatening to them because intimacy requires vulnerability, accountability, and the courage to confront uncomfortable emotions. Instead of facing those feelings, they often retreat into distance, silence, or emotional detachment. Every unanswered message, every withdrawal, and every moment they seem emotionally unavailable is usually a reflection of the conflict happening inside them. While it may feel deeply personal, much of their behavior is driven by their own emotional defenses rather than by your worth. Understanding this distinction changes everything because it helps you stop carrying responsibility for struggles that were never yours to begin with. Most people instinctively respond to this silence by trying even harder. They send another message, ask for another conversation, or desperately search for reassurance. They hope that if they explain themselves one more time, the avoidant person will finally understand the pain they've caused. Unfortunately, this often creates the opposite effect. The more pressure an avoidant feels, the stronger their instinct becomes to pull away. Their nervous system interprets emotional intensity as something overwhelming rather than inviting. Instead of moving closer, they create even greater distance because that feels emotionally safer. It isn't necessarily because they don't care. It's because their coping style tells them that escaping discomfort is easier than facing it. Once you understand this psychological pattern, your entire perspective begins to shift. You stop reacting from panic and start responding with emotional wisdom, knowing that calm self-control is far more powerful than emotional pursuit. The greatest shift happens when you stop making their acknowledgement the center of your emotional world. That doesn't mean pretending you were never hurt or acting like you no longer care. It means choosing yourself instead of endlessly chasing someone else's validation. Imagine carrying yourself with quiet confidence, knowing your value without needing another person to confirm it. That kind of emotional stability changes the entire dynamic. As you stop seeking their approval, you naturally create room for something they rarely experience. Silence that isn't filled with pursuit. That absence gives them space to confront thoughts they've been avoiding. Human beings often become far more aware of what is missing than what is constantly available. When your energy is no longer invested in convincing them to understand your pain, they lose the emotional safety net that allowed them to postpone accountability. Your quiet strength becomes far more noticeable than repeated attempts to be heard. Healthy boundaries become one of the most powerful tools you possess during this process. Every time you choose to honor your feelings instead of abandoning them for someone else's comfort, you reinforce your own self-respect. You stop participating in a cycle where your emotional needs are consistently overlooked. This isn't about punishing the avoidant person or trying to manipulate their emotions. It's about refusing to sacrifice your peace in exchange for temporary attention. As you remain steady and consistent, they are left alone with the emotional consequences of the distance they created. Without someone constantly rescuing the connection or softening the impact of their choices, they begin to experience the discomfort they've been trying to avoid. That discomfort often becomes the first genuine opportunity for self-reflection. Real accountability rarely appears because someone demanded it. It grows when a person finally becomes willing to face themselves honestly. If that moment of reflection arrives, something meaningful can begin to happen. The avoidant person may finally recognize the silence they created, the opportunities they missed, and the emotional pain their actions left behind. An apology, if it comes, is no longer motivated by pressure or guilt, but by genuine awareness. That kind of acknowledgement carries far more meaning because it comes from personal realization rather than emotional force. Yet even if those words never arrive, your greatest victory has already taken place. You have reclaimed ownership of your emotional well-being instead of placing it in someone else's hands. Too many people spend years waiting for closure from someone who may never be emotionally prepared to give it. Real healing begins when you understand that your peace, your confidence, and your self-worth were never meant to depend on another person's ability to admit they were wrong. When you realize that your happiness has become tied to whether someone apologizes, it's no surprise that the pain feels overwhelming. Your emotional well-being begins to depend on a response that may never come, leaving you trapped in a cycle of waiting and hoping. Real strength begins the moment you turn your attention back toward yourself. Instead of chasing someone else's validation, you begin strengthening your own foundation through self-respect, emotional resilience, and quiet confidence. You remind yourself that your value doesn't rise or fall based on another person's willingness to admit they were wrong. Whether they choose accountability or continue avoiding it, your worth remains unchanged. That is one of the greatest lessons you can learn about avoidant dynamics. The true reward isn't simply receiving an apology, it's becoming emotionally grounded enough that your peace can no longer be taken away by another person's choices. As you continue through this journey, you'll begin to understand the subtle psychological forces that shape these interactions. Rather than reacting from heartbreak, frustration, or desperation, you'll learn to respond with patience, clarity, and emotional control. That shift changes everything. Confidence slowly replaces anxiety, and calm begins to replace emotional chaos. The avoidant person's behavior no longer controls your emotional state because you understand the deeper patterns behind it. If you've ever felt abandoned, dismissed, or emotionally neglected, don't rush to bury those feelings. Let them become valuable teachers instead. They reveal where you've been giving too much without receiving the same care in return. They highlight the places where your boundaries needed strengthening. Once you recognize those lessons, you create the opportunity to change the entire dynamic while protecting your dignity, preserving your self-respect, and building relationships that honor your emotional needs. The principles you'll discover aren't built on tricks or manipulation. They are rooted in timeless patterns of human behavior, showing how attention, emotional distance, reflection, and natural consequences influence the way people think and feel. As you apply these ideas, you'll gain something far more valuable than simply hearing the words, "I'm sorry." You'll develop the emotional tools to create lasting closure within yourself. If an apology eventually comes, you'll be able to receive it from a place of strength instead of emotional dependence. And if it never comes, you'll still walk away with something no one can take from you: your confidence, your self-worth, and your inner peace. That is the kind of empowerment that lasts because it comes from within, rather than relying on someone else's willingness to acknowledge the pain they caused. There is certainly something satisfying about seeing another person finally recognize the impact of their actions. Watching someone face the truth can bring a sense of justice and emotional relief. Yet an even greater freedom comes when you realize that your healing was never meant to depend on that moment. Once you stop making their acknowledgement the foundation of your recovery, you become emotionally free. With that understanding in place, it's important to look more closely at the avoidant mindset. This isn't about defending harmful behavior or making excuses for emotional neglect. It's about gaining enough clarity to stop taking everything personally. Most avoidant individuals aren't driven by cruelty. They are driven by fear. Fear of vulnerability, fear of emotional exposure, and fear of confronting feelings that seem overwhelming to them. Because of those fears, avoidant people often respond to emotional situations by creating distance instead of connection. When conversations become emotionally intense or accountability enters the picture, they instinctively withdraw because retreat feels safer than staying present. Their actions may look uncaring, but beneath the surface they are often struggling with emotions they don't know how to process. This is why demanding an apology rarely produces genuine change. Arguing, pleading, repeatedly explaining your pain, or reminding them of what they did usually increases their discomfort rather than encouraging reflection. The more emotionally cornered they feel, the stronger their urge becomes to escape. Understanding this pattern allows you to stop exhausting yourself trying to force a response that their nervous system is actively resisting. Human psychology consistently shows that people often become more aware of what they've lost when they have the space to truly experience its absence. Pressure invites resistance, but thoughtful distance encourages reflection. When an avoidant realizes that you are no longer rushing in to fix every conflict or soften every consequence, they are left alone with the emotional weight of their own choices. This doesn't mean pretending you don't care or suppressing your feelings. Instead, it means stepping back with purpose while honoring your own emotional well-being. Your patience, your steady presence, and the care you once gave become far more noticeable when they are no longer constantly available. That quiet space gives them an opportunity to recognize the role you played in their life, and in many cases, it becomes the beginning of genuine self-examination. Many people unintentionally keep themselves trapped because they underestimate the importance of emotional independence. They continue sending messages, repeating explanations, and searching for ways to make the avoidant finally understand their perspective. Yet truth loses much of its impact when it is constantly pushed onto someone who isn't ready to receive it. People need the freedom to process experiences on their own and to encounter the natural consequences of their behavior. Your greatest strength appears not when you fight to prove your worth, but when you quietly live as though you already know it. Consistent self-respect disrupts unhealthy relationship patterns because it removes the emotional reactions that once kept those patterns alive. Your calm presence becomes a mirror that gently reflects reality back to them without force or argument. Silence, when chosen intentionally, should never be confused with giving up. It is often one of the strongest forms of emotional discipline. By refusing to seek constant validation, you stop participating in the cycle that allows avoidance to continue unchecked. You remove the distractions that once helped them escape accountability and create space for uncomfortable but necessary reflection. Within that silence, unresolved emotions begin demanding attention. Awareness slowly develops, and awareness is what makes genuine accountability possible. Meaningful apologies are rarely born from pressure or guilt. They emerge when someone honestly recognizes the consequences of their own actions. Maintaining healthy boundaries may appear passive on the surface, but it is actually an active demonstration of emotional strength. Over time, your unwavering peace becomes impossible to ignore. While they may try to justify their behavior or distract themselves, human nature naturally seeks emotional resolution, making honest reflection increasingly difficult to avoid. Whenever a conflict remains unresolved, emotional tension rarely stays the same. Instead, it slowly builds over time until something eventually has to change. This is one of the most important psychological principles to understand when dealing with an avoidant person. When you combine patience with emotional stability, that natural process begins working in your favor. The key is recognizing that this isn't about trying to make someone feel guilty or manipulating their emotions. It is simply allowing the consequences of their choices to exist without constantly protecting them from those consequences. By remaining grounded, respecting your own boundaries, and refusing to chase after validation, you naturally highlight the difference between your emotional maturity and their pattern of avoidance. That contrast quietly encourages self-reflection in a way that arguments and emotional pressure almost never can. As they begin experiencing the absence created by their own decisions, they may gradually become aware of what their avoidance has cost them. If an apology eventually comes, it is far more likely to be sincere because it developed from genuine self-awareness instead of external pressure. A heartfelt acknowledgement carries much greater meaning than words spoken simply to end an uncomfortable conversation. At the same time, something equally valuable is happening within you. Every day you choose self-respect over emotional pursuit, You strengthen your resilience, deepen your confidence, and develop greater emotional independence. You stop believing that your peace depends on another person's willingness to recognize your pain. Instead, your sense of security begins growing from within. That inner transformation is the real foundation of lasting healing, because it allows you to stand firmly in your worth, regardless of someone else's response. As your emotional independence grows stronger, the entire relationship dynamic begins to change. An apology becomes something you can appreciate rather than something you desperately need in order to move forward. If they choose accountability, you can receive it with clarity instead of relief. If they remain unwilling to acknowledge the past, your life no longer remains emotionally paused, waiting for them to change. You continue moving forward with purpose, confidence, and self-respect. That is one of the greatest forms of personal empowerment. Understanding avoidant psychology isn't simply about influencing another person's behavior. It's about freeing yourself from the exhausting cycle of seeking emotional validation from someone who may not yet have the capacity to provide it. Once you reach that place, your emotional well-being belongs entirely to you, rather than depending on someone else's emotional readiness. Patience plays a far greater role in this process than most people realize. Genuine patience is not passive waiting or silently hoping that things eventually improve. It is an active decision to remain emotionally steady while allowing time to do what force cannot accomplish. Human emotions rarely change overnight. Self-awareness often develops slowly, especially for someone whose instinct is to avoid difficult feelings. Every attempt to rush that process usually strengthens their emotional defenses because pressure confirms the fears that already exist inside them. Patience, however, communicates something entirely different. It quietly demonstrates that your boundaries are firm, your emotional stability isn't easily shaken, and your attention is no longer available simply because someone chooses to return. That quiet consistency often becomes much more influential than repeated conversations ever could. Eventually, the avoidant person reaches a point where they must make a choice. They can continue living with the emotional tension created by unresolved issues, or they can begin confronting the truth they've been avoiding. This isn't because anyone forced them into that position. It happens because emotional consequences naturally accumulate over time when they are no longer interrupted by constant reassurance or rescue. Your role is not to create discomfort, but to stop removing it for them. By honoring your own emotional needs instead of endlessly accommodating theirs, you create an environment where honest reflection becomes increasingly difficult to escape. If they choose growth, it happens because they have reached that conclusion themselves. That kind of realization is far more meaningful and lasting than anything produced through guilt, arguments, or emotional pressure. It's equally important to remember that this journey should never become about revenge or making another person suffer. The goal is not to punish someone until they apologize or to make them feel as hurt as you once did. The purpose is much healthier than that. It is about allowing truth to emerge naturally without interference. When someone finally recognizes what they have lost and understands the impact of their actions, sincere accountability becomes possible. The beauty of this approach is that it doesn't rely on controlling another person's emotions. Instead, it relies on mastering your own. Your calm, emotional stability, and unwavering self-respect become the quiet forces that inspire change, while also protecting your own peace, regardless of the outcome. As you continue moving forward, remind yourself not to fall back into old habits. Resist the urge to chase, beg, repeatedly explain yourself, or sacrifice your dignity in exchange for temporary attention. Stand confidently in the knowledge that your worth has never depended on another person's ability to appreciate it. Continue strengthening your boundaries, protecting your emotional energy, and trusting the psychological patterns you've come to understand. Whether reflection leads them toward remorse or not, you are already becoming stronger, wiser, and far more emotionally grounded than before. The greatest success is not simply hearing an apology. It is reaching a point where your emotional world remains stable because it is built on self-respect rather than someone else's approval. Once you've developed patience and emotional independence, another important principle begins to emerge: the quiet influence created by your own emotional consistency. This has nothing to do with manipulation, mind games, or controlling another person's decisions. Instead, it reflects the natural way human beings respond to changes in behavior, attention, and emotional availability. Avoidant individuals are often highly aware of shifts in relationship patterns, even when they don't openly acknowledge them. They notice when your energy changes, when your boundaries become healthier, and when you stop reacting from pain. Every moment you choose calm instead of emotional pursuit communicates something meaningful without requiring a single conversation. Through your actions, you quietly express that you are complete, emotionally secure, and fully capable of honoring your own value with or without their recognition. As we reach the end of this journey, remember that the greatest lesson is not how to make someone apologize. It is how to become the kind of person whose peace is no longer controlled by another person's choices. An apology can bring relief, but it should never become the foundation of your healing. Real healing begins the moment you stop placing your value in someone else's hands and start recognizing the strength that has always existed within you. Every boundary you honor, every emotional impulse you choose not to follow, and every moment you remain grounded instead of reacting is a step toward a stronger version of yourself. Those small decisions may not seem dramatic in the moment, but over time, they reshape the way you see yourself and the way others experience you. They transform you from someone searching for validation into someone who naturally commands respect, because you first learned to respect yourself. If an avoidant person eventually recognizes the pain they caused, let that acknowledgement be received with wisdom rather than desperation. A sincere apology has value because it reflects genuine awareness, not because it determines your worth. And if that apology never comes, your life does not remain unfinished. You are still capable of moving forward with confidence, clarity, and emotional freedom. The truth is that every relationship, whether it lasts or ends, teaches something valuable. Some relationships teach us how to love, while others teach us how to protect our peace. Both lessons are equally important. Instead of measuring your progress by whether someone changes, measure it by how much calmer, wiser, and more emotionally secure you have become. That is the transformation that truly lasts because it belongs to you and cannot be taken away. Always remember that people can only meet you as deeply as they are willing to meet themselves. An avoidant person cannot offer consistent emotional accountability until they are prepared to face their own fears, insecurities, and patterns. That journey belongs to them, just as your healing belongs to you. You cannot carry another person's emotional work, and you should never sacrifice your own well-being trying to do so. What you can control is the way you respond, the standards you set, and the life you choose to build moving forward. Every time you choose self-respect over chasing, patience over panic, and emotional stability over emotional dependence, you quietly rewrite your story. You stop living in reaction to someone else's behavior and begin living according to your own values. That shift is where true freedom begins. So, hold your head high, protect your peace, and continue becoming someone who refuses to settle for relationships built on uncertainty or emotional inconsistency. Trust that the right people will appreciate your honesty, respect your boundaries, and value the love you offer without needing to be convinced. Continue investing in your own growth because confidence, emotional maturity, and self-respect will always attract healthier connections than fear, pursuit, or desperation ever could. Whether the person who hurt you eventually apologizes or not, never forget this truth. Your worth was never diminished by their inability to recognize it. Your value has always been yours. Your peace has always been yours to protect. And your future has never depended on someone else's willingness to acknowledge what they failed to appreciate. The moment you truly believe that, you no longer wait for permission to heal. You simply move forward with strength, wisdom, and the quiet confidence that nothing outside of you can ever take away.